We are speaking with Scott Charles. He is the Trauma Outreach Coordinator for Temple Hospital. Scott, welcome to the program. It is nice to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's just go ahead and jump into these questions here. First off, can you kind of give us your background, tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I've been doing this work for about 13 years. I came to Philly about 20 years ago, grew up in California. When I was about 2, one of my older brothers was shot. When I was 5, one of my older brothers was shot. Both of them survived. When I was 9, my father died. And when I was 10, my sister Angie used one of my father's guns to commit suicide. And so you can say that I kind of came to this profession, honorably, naturally. And, one of the things that has always interested me about this issue is just trying to find ways that we can be more innovative and think outside the box when it comes to tackling the issue of gun violence. Gun violence for generations has disproportionately affected inner city communities and disadvantaged people. And so a lot of the conversations that we're having now take really kind of traditional approaches to addressing this, particularly when we talk about mass shootings and what have you. But what I've always sought to do is to come up with means of addressing the community that's rooted in community. And so prior to working in this field 13 years ago, I worked with at-risk kids, working everywhere from Sacramento, California, Los Angeles, California, in Columbus, Ohio, and then most recently Philadelphia.
Okay, great. Now you did mention that this issue with, I guess, gun violence does disproportionately affect the inner cities. Why do you know why that may be?
There are a number of reasons. You're looking at communities that, by absolutely no accident, have been disenfranchised. The one thing that we don't have access to is jobs. The one thing that we've been provided easy access to would be handguns. And what you find is that you can look at the same demographic of people, and the only thing you would have to change is income, and you find that those folks are not shooting one another. In many ways, the gun becomes a proxy for one's sense of self and sense of identity. And so, what we find is if we replace those guns with jobs, people stop shooting one another. And so it's one of the greatest challenges that we have. And one of the problems, the way that gun violence differs from more traditional forms of violence is that when you introduce a handgun into that equation, it changes the entire transaction. It changes the entire script. You cannot go back from that. Even if the trigger is never pulled, the possibility that your foe has a gun changes the way you're going to interact. And so the trick is trying to prevent that gun from coming out in the first place. And so I've spent a great deal of time just trying to stress the importance of never kind of bringing it to that level.
So tell us about your Cradle to Grave project and actually how it works.
Yeah, so the purpose of Cradle to Grave is to bring young people into the hospital as students, as learners, rather than to have them come in as patients. We started the program about 12 years ago because we wanted to address the sharp spike that we had seen in juvenile gunshot injury. We saw about a 40% spike among kids being shot in the city. And so the idea behind the program was simple: to try to provide a counterbalance to the messages that they get that kind of glorify gun violence. And in no way do those images that they see or those videos that they see represent what we really see in the hospital. And so from my conversations with young people, young gunshot survivors, I would ask them, is this kind of what you thought it would be like? And most often they would say, no, this isn't anything like I thought it was going to be like. In fact, I wouldn't wish this upon my own worst enemy. And this idea of not wishing it upon your own worst enemy, the person who even shot you, you wouldn't want them to suffer this. says everything you need to know about how awful that experience is. But it's a hell of a thing to require somebody to be shot, to have them learn that lesson. And so what we wanted to do is to bring them behind the scenes and let them meet doctors and nurses who look like them, who come from their neighborhoods, who could talk to them about the realities of gunshot injury, as a way to dissuade them from really, I mean, a lot of people think of it as we're trying to tell kids not to get shot, which is a very difficult thing to do, because nobody really wants to be shot. But what we're hoping that they'll take from it is that they never want to pull that trigger. They never want to point that gun at somebody else. And so since its inception, we've brought more than 12,000 kids through the program, with the hope that we have a city or a significant number of people in the city that have a greater appreciation for for what it means to pull that trigger.
So is this the program that you initially wanted to, like, from the idea of getting people to understand what these victims actually go through? Because I'm sure at some point maybe they have actually know firsthand or secondhand already what these victims could possibly go through. And so is this the program that you initially had in mind, or were there any barriers to actually getting something in the first place?
Oh, hold on, I lost you. There you go. So I think the truth is this is a program that's always kind of evolving, but it is very much what we had hoped to accomplish. We're now expanding the program to bring in people who are not just from the neighborhoods, but are in fact gun offenders. And so we're working more and more with adult populations and men and women who are reentering society, coming home from prison, many of whom have gun offenses. And even though they grew up in neighborhoods where there's gun violence, I mean, when you think about it, the hospital is really where we've, built this barrier that says you can't come in here and you can't see what it is. And so one of the natural things that happens when people get shot is they begin, there are a couple things that happen. One is that they'll oftentimes just get out of the game altogether and change up everything about the way they're living. But what also happens is when there aren't options for them to leave the neighborhood, to find other vocations or whatever, they then have to steel themselves for the reality of what they're going to face when they leave the hospital. And by the time they get home, they've hardened themselves to the point that they're not going to share with their friends the kinds of things that they're sharing with me inside the hospital, their greatest fears, their sense of vulnerability, or any of those things. And so when they talk about that experience to their friends and to their neighbors, it doesn't look anything like what I'm seeing in the hospital room. And so what gets conveyed is that it's no big deal to be shot. And which is why when I talk to them about whether or not this is like what they thought it would be, it's because nobody told them, like, yeah, I was in here, I was crying. I couldn't eat for, a week. I sat here and I starved. I had a NG tube in my nose, sucking the contents out of my belly, and I couldn't eat or drink water. And I, spent all night crying, and, that's just not something that they're likely to share.
So I guess in a way that this is reminding me of the Scared Straight program.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're probably familiar with that.
Yeah.
Which I guess provided tours to youth to deter them from crime.
Yeah.
How would
it
you
was a terrible failure.
Different, right?
It was terrible.
Not very valuable as far as a deterrent. So would you say that there's any parallels here? How would you say that yours is different from something like that?
So I think one of the challenges, and I pose this to people who draw those comparisons, is, well, what do you think the similarities are? The only place where I see there are similarities is that you're bringing young people who have, in some cases, run afoul of the law. But many of the kids who come through my program have had no brushes with the law, but rather are parts of programs that want them to, get a sense of what's going on behind the scenes. But what you find is that the only thing that they have in common is that they're kids coming into a facility, and that the experience in the facility is not something that they would want, right? But what we know from Scared Straight is that you brought kids into a prison where recidivism was already incredibly high. And, in Philadelphia, recidivism is usually somewhere around 80%, right? So right there, you have a high number of people who serve real time. And the experience of serving real time doesn't serve as a deterrent from coming back and doing more time. So I'm not sure why anybody would think that bringing kids in for a couple hours is going to serve as a deterrent if doing real time doesn't. Conversely, if you look at firearm injury in cities like Philadelphia, despite what you might think, it's incredibly rare for the same individual to be shot a subsequent time. And in Philadelphia, a lot of that has to do with the fact that well, wherever you are, it's such an awful experience. It's not something that you want to live through twice. The other difference, just besides, on its face kind of recidivism and re-injury, is the fact that nobody in our hospital is shouting at kids or screaming at kids and trying to take this experience and ratcheting it up and amplifying it and trying to make it worse. In fact, what we do is we kind of slow it down, we break it down, and the experience of Cradle to Grave is one of tremendous reflection. And if anything, it's kind of it's somber. And we spend a great deal of time talking about love and talking about the sense of appreciation that we have for our family. And so we spend a lot of time in Cradle to Grave actually laughing and communing and talking about the value that our lives hold for one another or for ourselves and for the people who love us. So I think that those are the places where they obviously are different. But the only thing that they do really have in common is the fact that it involves kids going into a facility.
Yeah, that's fair. So when we look at the numbers for Philadelphia's and shootings since 2006, since your program started to, I guess, now, we noticed that there was a trend towards those shootings decreasing.
Sure, yeah.
So my question is two-part. Is one, do you think that your program could help explain the decrease that you've seen in those shootings? My second point is that now there's been an increase in shootings, and do you know if what could help explain the trend in the increase?
So the answer to your first question is no. We can't take credit for the decrease, and it would be naive to suggest for any program to suggest that they alone had something to do with that decrease. Cradle to Grave operates in Philadelphia, and we saw similar decreases throughout the country. One of the natural things that occurred is, you had in the wake of the crack epidemic, you had those markets drying up. And, prior to the crack epidemic, you didn't see that level of gun violence. And so with crack, you saw this tremendous spike. When those crack markets began to collapse, you saw the gun violence start to go away. If you want to look back in the last 3 years to figure out what's happened, you only have to ask yourself what's replaced crack in terms of one of the most profitable commodities in the neighborhood, and that's opioids. And so in Philadelphia, we can look at the very way that the gun violence has shifted from one neighborhood to the next. So in Philadelphia, over the past decade or 12 years or so, most of that gun violence was concentrated in the 22nd Police District, which is, I don't know how familiar you are with Philly, but that's west of Broad, and it's a historically African-American neighborhood, and that it was, in fact, where people were hustling and selling rock. In recent years, that gun violence has shifted up across Broad Street, and now it's east of Broad in the neighborhoods where opioids are being sold. And it's kind of left the 22nd Police District, and it's all now kind of concentrated in the 25th Police District where all the opioids are sold. And what one of the most frustrating parts of this reality is that you have individuals who come from the suburbs. Many of them are white, they live in the suburbs, and they come to neighborhoods like Kensington and Fairhill, Spanish, predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, where opioids are being sold. And while they're not being shot, because the understanding is that you don't want to shoot your customer, that's going to drive business faster than anything, it nonetheless creates competition for that money. And you have these young dudes out there who this is their way of eating. And so they will do what they have to do to eat. And so it creates this increase in competition over that drug money. And where there hadn't been a lot of shootings, we're now seeing that. And it began 3 or 4 years ago when we started seeing that, slight uptick.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So the Philadelphia, I guess, Police Commissioner Richard Ross stated that last year, our biggest issue is retaliatory violence.
Mm-hmm.
Much of the time, it's young men using gun violence as a means to resolve disagreements. Do you agree with that statement, or do you feel that there is kind of a deeper issue involved?
So I don't know that those things are mutually exclusive. I mean, I think he's right in the sense that it's young men. We know that both perpetrators and victims tend to be incredibly young in Philadelphia. Gun homicide is a leading cause of death for young Black men. Age 19 is the most common age to be shot. The age range between, I think, 18 and 24, they represent about 40% of all gunshot victims in the city. So he's not wrong in the sense that it's really kind of centered around young men shooting one another. But I also think that there are more complicated issues other than young men. While there are lots of young Black men at HBCUs right now studying for tests or exams, tomorrow, they're not shooting one another. So I think it has a lot to do with youth. We know that if we can keep young men alive to the age of 25 or late 20s or early 30s, they're going to do much better. But you have to do more than just kind of hope that they make it to 25. Ideally, what we're doing is we're educating them and we're providing them jobs in some level of stability so that they're not finding themselves out there having to hustle and ultimately picking up a gun, which becomes essentially an occupational hazard.
Excuse
God bless you. And one other thing that I would be remiss if I didn't point out is, and Ross, Richard Ross, who I think is, he's an honorable dude. But he'll tell you that it's, the irony is that it's also opioids, right? So you have the demand for the drugs, but you also have this interesting thing that's playing out in terms of the gun rights folks. So in Philadelphia, we have 40,000 active concealed carry permits in the city right now. Everybody here has a concealed carry permit, and all you have to do to get a concealed carry permit in Philadelphia is go down to this office it used to be in essentially Center City, and you go down there and you bring a $20 money order. You bring 2 pieces of mail that had your name on it, and they would do a quick background check. And if you didn't have a felony, you could walk out the door with a handgun, and you didn't have to demonstrate any kind of aptitude or any kind of skill to use that gun. You just left and you were able to carry a gun in the streets of Philadelphia. So that creates a number of problems, one of which is the fact that you have a lot of people who keep guns in cars. And this is Philly, so people break into your car and they find your gun, and now that gun is on the street. And we see that all the time, guns that aren't safely stored. And it just adds to this complexity, the ease with which individuals are able to get guns here in Philadelphia.
So why do you think it's actually that easy for people to get their hands on these weapons?
Well, that's one example of how people are able to get their hands on weapons. But for years, we had, disreputable gun dealers here, where at one point we traced this ridiculous percentage of crime guns back to one gun dealer. And what would happen is a young man who had a felony, who wasn't, legally allowed to go get a handgun, would engage in a straw purchase with his girlfriend, who would go in and help him buy 5 or 6 or 7 guns in one fell swoop. And then he would turn around and sell the other guns and more than cover the cost of the gun that he should have been prohibited from getting anyway. And so that went on for years. And we just now are so flush with guns in the city that it's incredibly easy for kids to get their hands on guns. And we see that. We see the turnaround time from the moment they have their first dispute with somebody to the ability to go grab a gun and settle this dispute. It's incredibly quick and easy because there's just so many guns in the city right now.
Um, so even though your program is currently focused on kind of these handgun violence against one-on-one people or one-on-one gun violence, do you see this program as preventing maybe a mass shooting like the one that occurred in Parkland?
No. There's, it really is as though we're living in two different worlds. Philly has mass shootings all the time. Chicago, Baltimore, and I hate to use Chicago or Baltimore because those have become dog whistles, right? For just another way of saying black, criminality. But anywhere, whether it's St. Louis or any of those mid-sized towns that really do have far more gun violence than Chicago per capita, we have mass shootings in those cities all the time. But they don't make the news because America does not see her children occupying those spaces. And so in Philly, we have mass shootings on playgrounds, at cookouts, on basketball courts. And even that goes by without being noticed. And so you could argue that my program may ultimately prevent that type of shooting. And who knows how many, mass shootings on that level that we've prevented. But in terms of somebody going into a theater and shooting up a movie theater or a classroom, that really isn't something that happens in the inner city at all. And so one of the interesting things to answer your question more directly is we occasionally bring kids from suburban high schools who are predominantly white. And they come into the program because it's, they have an interest in public health, and we want them to have an understanding of what goes on here because we want them to be sensitized to the plight of the people that are suffering high rates of gun violence. And what you find is that they do see it as being somewhat compelling, but on some level, they also keep it at an arm's length because for them, that's not their experience. Nobody that they know has been shot. On the flip side, when I bring kids from the neighborhood into the program and I ask them, how many of you know somebody who's been shot? They all know somebody who's been shot. And when I ask them, how many of you live with somebody who's been shot? Their hands stay up. I mean, some of the hands go down, but a lot of them actually live with somebody who's been shot. They just don't know what goes on from a clinical standpoint behind the scenes, which is what we're trying to teach them. But I don't know that our program is going to have any impact on the suburban shooter just because, one, we don't bring them in that often. But I just don't know, based on the way that we tell the story of this experience, which is in many ways very typical of kind of inner city interpersonal gun violence, that they see themselves in that scenario.
Interesting. So for our viewers, Scott, how would you consider this a public health issue, if at all?
Well, I don't, whether we were talking about HIV, AIDS, or we were talking about hypertension, any kind of, anything that afflicted such a significant, cross-section of society, we would automatically deem it a public health crisis. This is killing, like I said, it's the leading cause of death for young Black men in Philadelphia, as it is for many urban centers. There's no other way to define it other than a public health crisis. And one of the more challenging things is when we talk about gun violence, we always tend to think about the people who die, right? So the number I don't know, and when it comes to Parkland, is I can't remember how many kids were actually shot. The number that I have in my head is that 17 people died. And that's because, 3 adults died and 14 children died. But certainly more people than that were shot. And they're in hospitals right now, but we don't talk about them. Nor do we talk about the numbers of people in Las Vegas who were shot. But those people are requiring long-term care. And the kinds of injuries that they have are devastating, and they're among the most expensive injuries that we're gonna treat. And we can consider this a social issue, but at the end of the day, most of the people who get shot in interpersonal violence don't have health insurance. And the state is picking up the tab for that. So you can call it, I don't care what you want to call it, but ultimately they're being treated in hospitals, and your tax dollar is going to pay for that. And so it's certainly, and the other reason, not to get too deep into the woods, but if you look at the way that violence is transmitted, it's transmitted very much like any kind of virus. And so when we look in neighborhoods in Philadelphia, we know how, or we can predict with a high level of certainty the ways in which violence is going to spread. And the police officers in Philly, they use very sophisticated data to begin to predict where that violence is going to break out. And they put cops in those areas to try to stem it, just as you would with any kind of virus.
So Scott, you were one of 10 recipients of, who was awarded the Robert Wood Johnson Community Health Leader Award in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
How did you end up using your winnings?
That's none of your business. No, I bought a car. No, I actually applied it to buying equipment for our hospital for the demonstration, and would pay for things like buses to bring kids into the program. And I actually hired somebody who was able to provide assistance to me for the next year, so that the majority of the money went to salary and things like buying equipment.
Oh.
But I did get a little bit of a personal reward that came out of that. But what I did with that is absolutely none of your business.
Oh, that's fine. It was well earned too.
I'm messing with you. It wasn't anything very interesting.
So, can you tell us a bit about your Turning Point program and why it is important to help survivors of gun violence?
Yeah, I mean, so, the one thing that we know is that gunshot survivors are unlikely to be re-injured, but we don't really have a great deal of data on the numbers of individuals who will seek to retaliate after they've been shot themselves. But we do have reason to suspect that they may go out there and they may retaliate. But what we hope to do is we want to use this opportunity for those individuals who've been shot. And we find that the individuals who've been shot are oftentimes more motivated to take advantage of services than somebody who hasn't been shot. As you can imagine, this is a wake-up call for them. And so what we do is we take advantage of this, what we call the golden hour, this window that has opened up. And while they're kind of wide open and eager for change, we try to provide them things like job training. We connect them to educational services, so that many of them don't have their high school diploma. So we connect them with a group that'll help them get their GEDs, a group of individuals who will help mentor them, and literally call them all the time just to check in on them. And these mentors will do things like pick them up and transport them to doctor's appointments, job interviews, or what have you. So what we essentially do is I always joke that we create these kind of old heads that are on call at all times, and who can kind of wrap their arms around these guys and help support them. And one of the key things that has come out of this initiative are the numbers of men who've been shot who are now taking advantage of mental health services. Initially, we weren't sure that was going to be something that we could kind of sell. And what we find now is that a lot of the men who've been shot are coming in for individual therapy, one-on-one counseling, and they see a therapist once a week. And these are the guys that they'd be the last people that you think would do this. And now we're starting to bring them in for group therapy, and to have them have them begin sharing their experiences. And so that really is one of the key reasons behind the program. And it's also just to, plant seeds out into the neighborhood. So if we take a guy who's been shot, who, you take that situation, it can go very bad very quickly. And we say, well, let's flip this and let's take this guy who's been shot and who might otherwise go out there and seek to hit back at the dude who shot him. We're going to give this guy a job and give him reasons to not want to retaliate. And we're going to put him back in the neighborhood. And then hopefully he can put on some people from his neighborhood with a job or what have you. And that's really one of the goals.
So another program that you are involved in is Fighting Choice.
No, Fighting Chance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you tell our viewers a little bit more about that program?
Yeah, Fighting Chance is a program. We were approached by a member of the community in North Philadelphia a few years ago, and he was explaining that he had seen a number of people get shot and unfortunately just pass away on the sidewalk because nobody in the neighborhood knew how to help them. And he asked, would you be able to teach us? And I was like, well, that's not what we do. We help people in the hospital. So I sought out people that I knew and trusted to say, hey, is there anything like this going on? And at the time there wasn't. And they said, this sounds like combat medicine. What you're describing sounds a lot like combat medicine. And there's a guy who's like a special forces, military ninja guy who works in the emergency department. You should talk to this guy. And I'd seen him around and I approached him, and he is everything you'd expect, special forces. He's got that, whatever 100-mile stare, whatever they call it, 100-yard stare. And I was kind of intimidated. I just said, look, I'm wondering if this is something you think we could do. And to my surprise, he said, not only is this something that we could do, it's something that we should do. And so he and I got together with this gentleman from the neighborhood, and we just started plotting out, like, what would the community want and what would they need and what would they be most receptive to? And we created this, basically a curriculum that we tried to take what the military had been doing for years, which is called TCCC, Trauma Combat Casualty Care. And what they did is they wanted to create a system that would allow soldiers with some very basic skills to save their comrades when they're out in the field of battle, and when they fall. Everybody in that unit knows how to stop bleeding, because bleeding is why people die from being shot. And so no matter where you are in the world, if you're in the military, your unit, if you're in combat, everybody in that unit knows how to stop bleeding. And so the idea is, if we could apply that to neighborhoods where you have high rates of gun injury, so that an individual who's walking down the street, if his best friend is shot, or if your son is shot, or your neighbor, you'll have the skills necessary to apply the same kinds of interventions that are being applied in other places in the world in combat. And then, one of the things that a lot of people don't appreciate is that in Afghanistan, your chances of surviving being shot in Afghanistan in combat are far greater than they are if you were to be shot here in the United States. It's probably the place you're most likely to survive in, just because everybody knows what to do. So we started doing that. We've trained probably about 900 people in Philadelphia in how to stop the bleed. And it's interesting because I use the term stop the bleed. About 6 months after we started the program, the Obama administration announced that they wanted to teach as many people in America how to do how to stop the bleed. And so they created this campaign. And we were probably the first non-governmental agency, or the only non-governmental agency that participated in the launch of that program. The way that we're different is that we focus on neighborhoods where we know that there's going to be gun violence. They do a great job. It's been since taken over by the American College of Surgeons. And they're doing a tremendous job getting the word out and disseminating the information. But I think they're looking at, kind of training as many people in the population as possible in anticipation of such things that we saw in Parkland. And I always argue, for us, from a practical standpoint, we don't know where the next mass shooting is, but we can pretty much predict with a high level of probability where the next kind of shooting is going to be. And so we look at neighborhoods that have high rates of gunfire, and we go into those neighborhoods and we train those community members. So
speaking of that particular initiative, how were you, or how are they training people to get over this kind of diffusion of responsibility? I don't know if you've heard of that. It's kind of where, someone else is going to take care of it. It's not my responsibility.
Right. So the bystander effect.
Somebody to where, no, it's actually everybody's responsibility. You know?
Right. So, part of that is people do want to help, and they just don't know what to do. What you're talking about obviously is the bystander effect. But one of the things that causes that is just the lack of knowing exactly what it is to do. And so one of the things that we do during the training and that we emphasize is that somebody has to determine that there's a leader in that scenario. So we rehearse these scenarios over and over, and people take turns being the leader in those situations, and saying, listen, you call 911, or you do this, you do that. And we, based on social psychology, we know that that's one of the things that helps counter that bystander effect, is actually telling somebody, I need you to go do this. But we'll only know in years from now, after we've kind of trained a significant number of people in the community, whether or not what we're doing matters. We simply don't now, because we just haven't trained enough people. We're in a city of 1.5 million people. It's going to take us a while to reach that critical mass.
All right, so wrapping up here, what is the main message that you'd like people to take home with them today, from all the work that you've done and continue to do?
I don't know. It's incredibly frustrating, because this is, while the numbers have decreased over the last decade for the most part, this is something that seems to be somewhat intractable, this level of gun violence. And I'm in a city where since 2002, something like 24,000 people have been shot. It's a city where somebody's shot every 7 hours. I always say to the kids, just looking at the numbers of people who were shot in Philadelphia last year, you would need like 41 classrooms to hold all the people who were just shot in Philadelphia just last year. Last year, there were only 21 days where nobody got shot in the city. And usually on those days, anywhere between 3 to 5 people get shot each day in Philadelphia. When I go to work every day, I'll meet every gun victim who gets admitted to the hospital. And I think it's hard for people to fathom the constant drumbeat of gun violence that plays out in America's inner cities. And the thing that is frustrating is, and this sounds, I don't want this to sound bad, and I don't know that there is a way to make it not sound bad, but the attention that is paid to situations like Parkland, that's the only time that gun violence seems to, get any attention. And the truth is, you can take every shooting victim from every mass shooting since Columbine, and it wouldn't equal the number of victims we had shot just in Philadelphia last year. And so, what I think the one message that I'd want people to understand is that we matter too. All of our kids matter, not just those kids who are going to high school in suburban neighborhoods, or who attend the premiere of a movie screening, that our kids matter too.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so we were speaking with Scott Charles. He is the Trauma Outreach Coordinator for Temple Hospital System. And Scott, thanks so much for talking with us today. I really appreciate it. Thanks for answering all my questions.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.